General Zinni is the youngest of 4 children, born to a family of Italian immigrants in Philadelphia. And in fact, if you listen carefully, you may still hear a little Philadelphia in his voice. He attended Villanova University, where he received a bachelor's degree in economics. Upon graduation, General Zinni was commissioned as an infantry second lieutenant in the Marine Corps, following in the footsteps of his father, who served in World War I. General Zinni once said in an interview that he had never intended to have a long military career. But through over 3 decades of service to this country, he distinguished himself through his hands-on style and his lack of reticence in challenging conventional wisdom. During the last 3 years of his career with the armed forces, General Zinni was Commander-in-Chief, U.S. Central Command, responsible for U.S. forces in a 25-country region ranging from the Horn of Africa and the Middle East to parts of the former Soviet Union. He joined the U.S. Central Command in September 1996 as Deputy Commander-in-Chief. Following Desert Storm, he served as the Chief of Staff and Deputy Commanding General of Combined Task Force Private Comfort, a Kurdish relief effort in Turkey and Iraq. During 1992 and 93, General Zinni directed Unified Task Force Somalia during Operation Continue Hope, and earlier he was Deputy Commanding General of the U.S. Marine Corps Combat Development Command at Quantico, Virginia. General Zinni also holds a master's degree in international relations, and in fact, I think we may have some students here in international relations tonight, and certainly we have some students here in the master's program in peace and justice studies. He also holds a master's in management and supervision. His many decorations include the Defense Distinguished Service Medal with Oak Leaf Cluster, the Defense Superior Service Medal with 2 Oak Leaf Clusters, the Bronze Star Medal with Combat V, thank you, and Gold Star, the Purple Heart, the Meritorious Service Medal with Gold Star, and personal decorations from South Vietnam, France, Italy, Egypt, Kuwait, Yemen, and Bahrain. He has also received numerous civilian awards, including the Papal Gold Cross of Honor, the Union League's Abraham Lincoln Award, the Italic Studies Institute's Global Peace Award, and a number of others. Early in his career, General Zinni served in Vietnam in what appears to have been a transformative experience. He has said that his experience there taught him the importance of developing an understanding of different cultures, particularly non-Western ones. This sensitivity to other cultures and peoples comes through clearly in a book he is presently writing with Tom Clancy entitled Battle Ready, to be published by Putnam. Since retiring from the Marine Corps, General Zinni has effectively bridged the divide between the military and diplomatic service by being named Special Envoy to the Middle East by Secretary Colin Powell, and has taken part in diplomatic missions to a number of countries. General Zinni notes in this soon-to-be-published book that when he retired, he had hoped to be able to continue to be active and to make a contribution to peacemaking. He is doing so today through work on conflicts in Aceh in Indonesia, with the Henri Dunant Center for Humanitarian Dialogue in Geneva, with the U.S. Institute of Peace on the conflict in Mindanao in the Philippines, and also working with our neighbors at the University of California, their Institute for Global Conflict and Cooperation on a project in the Middle East. When he is not traveling, he teaches at William and Mary College. From a conversation with him this afternoon, I must say that it seems quite evident that General Zinni is very passionate about his teaching, has great care and consideration for his students, and also has great optimism about this new generation of college students. General Zinni has been an outspoken critic of the war in Iraq. In a talk at the Middle East Institute in Washington in October 2002, he said, "It's not whether you're greeted in the streets as a hero. It's whether you're still greeted as a hero when you come back a year later." It gives me great pleasure to welcome retired General Anthony Zinni.
Thank you. Well, you know you're getting old when the introduction lasts longer than your career, but I appreciate it, Joyce. I don't want to leave you with the idea that I suddenly retired and became a peacenik. My 39 years in the Marine Corps, we resolved some conflicts in the way we best knew how, and some need to be resolved that way. I found a life after the Marine Corps in trying to use diplomacy, learning the art of mediation, negotiation, facilitation, and trying to solve problems that way. I've come to the conclusion that it's like baseball. If you sort of bat 300, you're in the Hall of Fame. So I try to win 1 out of 3, and I think you're doing well. But most importantly, I think, in these efforts, you find that even the ones that aren't successful, that you save a few lives along the way, or you delay conflict, or you allow a situation where the conflict isn't as bad as it might have been. And so any little bit that you do counts. It's not a game where the final score is the issue. In many cases, in the mediation efforts I participated in, we were pleased and thrilled to get an agreement, only to find later that it couldn't be implemented on the ground. And I'll talk a little bit tonight about the parts of all this and how they work, how the military functions in this, how we have to learn to cooperate with each other, and how we're just discovering the tools we need. I want to take you back to the beginning of the last decade of the last century, about 1989, 1990. I had been assigned my first brigadier general assignment to the European Command in Stuttgart, Germany. And I had just arrived there as the wall came down. And I would tell you that the place was in a state of shock. This is a half-century of Cold War, a military that had grown the U.S. participation into the hundreds of thousands, a way of life, careers that had known nothing but the Cold War. We had believed that we could contain communism, that communism was flawed, it was innately flawed, and it would collapse. And yet when it did, we were shocked. When that wall came down, I happened to be in Berlin, and I was with a young Army second lieutenant from the Berlin Brigade, and he had a couple of us generals with him, and he was stuck with the job of escorting us around. And he looked at us and he said, "Let's go on the other side of the wall to East Berlin." Of course, we said, "Can we do that?" Like a second lieutenant should. He said, "I don't know, let's try it." So we jumped in a van that he had, and we drove through the now abandoned Checkpoint Charlie into the other side of Berlin, only to discover that the main street was a facade. There were still pockmarked bullet holes in the buildings right off the main street. We drove into a Russian caserne, and they were confused, didn't know whether to shoot us or kiss us or what. And to all of us, this was a shock. As we drove through there, and as we stopped and we talked to East Germans and Russian military people, we saw them in a state of shock too. And for me, it was trying to come to grips with what this all meant and what it would mean. During my time there, President Bush had said, President Bush 41, that this represented a new era, a new world order, and a peace dividend on top of it. We watched as the military in Europe came down drastically. In my time there, the reduction in force, the disbanding of units, wholesale. We had a remarkable commander-in-chief, Supreme Allied Commander of Europe at the time, Jack Galvin, someone who we revered, an enlisted corpsman in the Second World War that had made it up to the position of Supreme Allied Commander, respected and admired and honored by all those NATO forces and those who were fortunate to serve with him. And he said, "I don't think it's going to be that clean." And he believed that we needed to do something to shape this post-Cold War period. He immediately required us to go into the former Soviet Union and into Eastern Europe with instructions to grab hold of the militaries there. The Russian military, the militaries now that were fragmenting into different republics to the East European countries, and to convince them that there's no victory here for our side. The victory is for their people. And to help them understand how a military should function in a democracy, and to convince them that they should be the models for that democracy. We spent a lot of time working with these militaries. We spent a lot of time sitting in conference rooms like this talking to them. we found that they were as confused as we were. In one case, we were to each of us NATO generals was to present a piece or a talk on democratization and the military and what it meant. And the first general we had get up was a Dutch general who spoke about the importance of unionizing your military in a democracy. Of course, we grabbed him off the stage right away and started to argue as the Russians looked at us and said, well, what do we do? Do we unionize or not? So we were more confused about how we taught them. Not long after that experience, the war in Iraq started. Saddam invaded Kuwait. Obviously, that fantastic military we had created to deter the Soviets or fight the Cold War if necessary, in its last great act, I remember the mighty 7th Corps of the United States Army that was in Europe about to be disbanded, went home via Iraq and managed, of course, to defeat Saddam brilliantly. I went in after that. After the war was over and the confetti and ticker tape parades were going on back here, down Broadway and other places in the country, we suddenly had to go back into northern Iraq because there was this punishment of the Kurds that Saddam was inflicting on them. And we got involved in resettling the Kurds and trying to resolve what we saw as a potential conflict that would last for quite a while. In the meantime, Secretary of State Baker decided that the Soviet Union won't repair and reconstruct on its own, the former Soviet Union. We need to help it. And he decided that we needed something akin to a Marshall Plan. We needed to work the international community to participate. Ambassador Rich Armitage, now Deputy Secretary of State, was assigned to lead the effort. I was assigned as his military coordinator or support. We tried mightily to go into this vast region of the former Soviet Union and help it adjust to this new life. Democracy, free market economy, political, economic, social change. We did not get the support we needed. We did not get the resources, the commitment by donors. The world believed that this was going to be an automatic reordering, that we need do nothing but pull back our defense spending and enjoy the fruits that we would gain from that and be able to apply to other programs, other issues, other needs that we might have. We couldn't have been more wrong. In that decade of the 90s, we found ourselves, I was 3 times in Somalia. We found ourselves in Haiti, in Bosnia, in Kosovo, one right after another of these problems, Rwanda, Burundi. And it seemed like the world was just coming apart. It was remarkable that this bipolar world, the Soviets and us, managed to keep a lid on all this. It seemed that once that lid was lifted, that all the ethnic hatreds, the effects of poverty, the things that maybe were controlled by the West and the East, and by the pressures and the investments and the money that went into gaining their support, had made sure that these things didn't explode, but that time had ended. I remember my time in Somalia looking at the amount of military equipment that was in that country. Soviet MiGs, US M16s, we both bid on that country, and at times Somalia had changed sides. And all it had to show for its association with the West or with the Soviet bloc was this collection of weapons that was just permeated every inch of that country and caused us problems while we were there. Our military went through a tremendous adjustment to this new world order. The pressure was on to reduce the size of the military. The military was phasing down, losing structure, but not changing. It was still a mini Cold War military, not really adjusted to this new environment. These constant missions that they were faced with, peacekeeping, humanitarian operations, complex emergency operations. The military desired to be the force that fought the nation's wars. Military leadership did not want to embrace, nor did they like these kinds of missions. They felt these missions degraded their ability to carry out their primary warfighting role. They felt these missions were not suited to the training, education, equipment, organization that they had. And beside, they were going through the throes of this change, which was very disorderly, not programmed, not thought through. There was no vision for transformation. There was reluctance amongst the old leadership not to find ourselves as peacekeepers or humanitarian workers, even though these were the missions that kept getting thrown on our plate. We did not work well with others out there. We found ourselves on these new battlefields with elements trying to deal with the political problems, with humanitarian problems, with economic reconstruction, with social problems. We found ourselves in many cases at odds with non-governmental organizations, with the political representatives from regional or international political bodies, or from our own diplomatic efforts. We found ourselves trying to work in areas we had no experience. When I was in Somalia, I was made the chief of police of Mogadishu. I sat on the judicial committee. I sat on the political committee for reconstructing the country. Nothing in my infantry experience prepared me for that. I worked and met every day with the NGOs. And when that 20-year-old girl with that Save the Whales t-shirt walked in, and this 55-year-old general in his flak jacket and helmet met her, there was automatic friction. She reminded me of my daughter, I reminded her of her father, and this wasn't going to work out. We could never bring ourselves to figure out how to make this work. We could never find ourselves in the military accepting this mission. We even tried to define what it was. We went through everything from calling it small wars to military operations other than war to stability operations. We can't even define it, let alone give it the kind of attention we would normally provide for these sorts of missions in doctrine, in organization, in materiel, in training and education. We viewed it as sort of a dirty little additional job to be done with as quickly as possible. Never did we figure that this was going to become the norm, and this would be the kind of mission we would be faced with throughout that decade and well into the 21st century. I want to take you back a little bit in history to the end of the First World War. At the end of the First World War, we had a visionary in President Wilson that saw if the conditions in the world that led to this war and the one previous to that were not changed, we would repeat it. He saw the old forms of the way the world ordered itself as obsolete and part of the problem. Colonialism, monarchies that were unresponsive. And he wanted to change the world. Obviously, he was branded an idealist, and our country, which was basically isolationist, rejected his idea to lead the effort to reshape Europe, to change the conditions in the world that led to these problems. And we were doomed to repeat the Second World War. Remarkably, at the end of the Second World War, President Truman and George Marshall, the Secretary of State, saw the same problem, but even in the face of the lack of popular support, decided that they would lead the effort. And we had the Marshall Plan, the European Recovery Plan. We had, for the first time in our history, joining a major military alliance, NATO, and actually being the heart of it and forming it. We signed up to treaties and alliances that changed the security structure in Europe and in the Far East. We assisted in aided in changing economic systems and political systems in this part of the world. And it once and for all ridded this region of the world of the chronic problems and the structures that led to the trouble we had. We are faced with the same problem now, in my mind. We have a region of the world that stretches from North Africa to the Philippines, from Central Asia to Central Africa, broadly called the Islamic world, that is in turmoil, that is in need of change, that is in need of understanding, that is in need of help, that is in need of encouragement, that is in need of the rest of the world, the free world community, of assisting it and aiding it and moving through it. Its problems are all known to us. They're called the war on terrorism, they're called the Iraq war, it's what goes on in Afghanistan, in Iran, it's the Middle East peace process or lack of a peace process, it's the breaking of relationships that we have in the region, it is the lack of a security structure. It is in desperate need of political reform and change, economic reform and change, social reform and change. It needs to have an internal dialogue with its own religious beliefs, an Islamic dialogue to sort out what the other Abrahamic religions had sorted out centuries ago. It is a part of the world that if we don't help it change, if we don't encourage it to change, if we don't pressure it to change, if we don't assist it to change, we are going to be going through the problems we have now well into this century. We need to act like the Trumans and Marshalls. We need to step back and get a strategic view. We need a grand strategy for dealing with this. And by we, I don't only mean the United States, but the rest of the world. In this part of the world, predominantly, are where we find the conflicts. These conflicts come out of ethnic hatred, religious hatred, poverty, environmental degradation, all sorts of issues that flow into this. They're not religious. Religion is a rationale. It is a means toward an end. It's a way you take a young man or woman who's politically, economically, socially repressed and give them the rationale to blow themselves up or to kill other innocents. It costs us. I was looking the other day on the internet at the World Bank website, and they had some statistics in there that were interesting. 80% of the 20 poorest countries end up, in the last 15 years, in civil war. 80% of the poorest countries have ended up in civil war in the last 15 years. 16% of the World Bank's loans go to mitigating these conflicts. And about 44% of these conflicts repeat themselves in 5 years. They don't get resolved, even though there is assistance or help or hope or an apparent solving of the problem. We probably can go through a list of lessons learned that will tell us how to better do things. We've done that many times, but it is really a question of will. Do we want to take on something that may be as politically unpopular as President Truman did? The Marshall Plan had 19% popular support in the United States at the time, and his approval ratings had dropped in 1 year from 82% to around 20-some% when he made these decisions and made these moves. Talk about tough, hard decisions. But if we don't change the world, it'll cost us more in the long run. The issue, the political will, means that we have to get involved earlier. We wait until it is a true catastrophe. We reject the idea of going in when we sense there's a problem. All of these issues and these conflicts can be broken down into 3 phases. There is the pre-conflict phase, when you can sense the issues and the problems, when we need to do a better job in gathering the intelligence and knowing what's brewing, where we can have some effect, and maybe with the work of institutes like the Kroc Institute, in prevention. There is the conflict stage, where we go in and have to mitigate and resolve the issues. And then there is the post-conflict phase, where we have to monitor it and maintain it and ensure it doesn't become one of those countries that in 5 years relapses back to the problems it has. Now, we have been reluctant to jump in until the situation is so bad that it requires a major effort, it requires military intervention, and is beyond the point where we can step back from violence. That's been the issue. I wrote 20 lessons learned before I retired on my experiences in 8 of these operations. And at the top, the very first one was the earlier the intervention, the easier it is to solve it. And now, since retiring, I have discovered institutes like the Kroc Institute, the Henri Dunant Center, the U.S. Institute of Peace, political organizations at the international and regional level, NGOs, that show potential for working in these areas, that can bring parties together, that can gather aid and support, that can encourage resolution at the table as opposed to the battlefield. We need to invest in those. Even after the conflict begins, we need to bring the professionals together. Joyce and I were talking earlier about the lack of coordination we find all the time. All those that join us on this unusual battlefield come as strangers to each other. The NGOs, those that are responsible for political reconstruction, those that are responsible for reestablishing the economy, those that are in there to try to affect social change, and those wearing uniforms that are in there to try to maintain security so all this can happen. They don't work well together. Believe me, the undercurrents coming out of Iraq is that the Coalition Provisional Authority and the military do not have a good relationship. And that's been repeated almost everywhere else where we've had those kinds of entities on the ground. We see the mission differently. We come from different cultures. We don't train and work together. We don't have a common understanding of what we're trying to do. And that, in the end, causes us these problems. We are now undergoing a soul searching in Washington about the lack of our ability to know when we were going to have problems, intelligence failures. This is an area where we have intelligence failures by the dozens, where we don't foresee these conflicts. We don't put enough emphasis on this. I remember when Rwanda and Burundi flared up. The Secretary of State at the time said the first thing they had to do at the principals meeting was find a map and figure out where Rwanda and Burundi were. I mean, we're in the middle of genocide, and we can't even locate the problem. If you listen to the testimony of the 9/11 Commission, one thing ought to strike you. Our government agencies don't work well together. They only come together at the very top. When you hear terms like Principals Committee, that means that's only at the top, at the senior cabinet levels. Can they bring it together? Ad hoc working groups that are thrown together when a crisis has reached its peak instead of before, when you could actually do something about it that would be less costly. During the Clinton administration, the President proposed a national security strategy that emphasized multilateralism and engagement. It was somewhat ill-defined. The Secretary of Defense, Bill Cohen, took that direction and actually put it into the Quadrennial Defense Review and assigned to us regional commanders. In those days, we were called commanders-in-chiefs. Secretary Rumsfeld didn't like that, too much power, so he's removed that. But us commanders-in-chiefs were then ordered to shape, prepare, and respond. The prepare and respond parts we knew. It had to do with the warfighting piece, with the ability to be ready to take military action with our allies in the region to protect our interests and our friends. We understood that. But this new word came out, shape. What did shape mean? And basically, he left it to us to decide what we needed to do from a military perspective to change the conditions in our part of the world or help it improve. I took this and divided up my goals in CENTCOM into three areas. One was the war fighting. Second was the day-to-day engagement that I had to conduct in the region. And the third was a new category that none of my predecessors had that I called development. What do I want this region of the world to look like 10, 15 years from now? And what can I do to make it happen? What can I do to make the region more stable? I found myself involved in more than the military effort. As a matter of fact, way beyond the military responsibilities. It was all going well until Dana Priest, a reporter from the Washington Post, outed me in a book called The Mission. And all us sinks, PACOM, EUCOM, and SOUTHCOM, we're all doing the same thing. Taking charge, developing our own regional strategies, working very closely with our diplomatic colleagues from the State Department and others in trying to change the environment. There was one flaw in all this, although I believe it was the correct view. The flaw was no resources. A Congress then that did not believe in aid, did not believe in anything that looked like aid and assistance, did not believe the military should step outside its bounds of pure military activities, and did not fund the other agencies of government like the State Department to pick that up. So in the end, we were developing strategies that did not acknowledge the resources that were needed. As a matter of fact, we were required to prepare something called a theater engagement plan, and in that theater engagement plan, we were only to address the ends and ways and not the means. And we would not even identify where these resources might come from. What might have been an investment, a small investment to prevent conflict, was not made. And so in the end, what you end up is paying the price much more dearly when the conflict begins. Even in just a small, narrow military line, you could do things to prevent conflict. You can train militaries to handle problems before they get great. You can train militaries to be responsible, to learn how to function properly, educate their leadership. We went on an effort on a skimpy budget to try to help the Africans help themselves. Countries like Kenya that had militaries that were willing to work on preventing humanitarian disasters, preventing conflict, becoming more proficient at peacekeeping in its early stages, humanitarian intervention before it became a problem and it erupted into something they couldn't handle, changing the image of their militaries, becoming much more responsible, becoming models for their own people. All this was possible with minimal investment, yet we would not make the investment, but we paid for it later on in the interventions and wars. I think we're at a point now where we need to step back from all these problems, and we need to think of them as component parts of a larger issue. And we need to develop that strategic view. And we need partners out there. I talk to my friends in the Middle East who are discouraged since no one comes to them and asks for their input. There is no formal process of consultation. They are discouraged because the security structure they had before the Iraq War is now gone. The troop presence out there has been changed. The unofficial alliance and the understanding that we created with the countries in the region has now been erased. They look to us to say, what follows? What is the new arrangement? Who do we fall in behind? How many troops are you going to have here? When we contained Saddam Hussein on a day-to-day basis in the entire CENTCOM, Central Command region, we had less troops containing him that go to work in the Pentagon every day. That was the cost. We had countries in the region paying $300 to $500 million a year to support our presence. We had countries in the region like Saudi Arabia that built $240 million housing complex for our troops. We had every country in the Gulf Cooperation Council, including Egypt and Jordan, that every time we struck Iraq or took military action, supported us with bases, overflight rights. We had countries in the region when we went to war elsewhere came with us. In Somalia, Egypt, United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait sent troops to join us. In the Balkans, we had troops from Jordan. Pakistanis paid the price in Somalia for joining us with more killed and wounded than we had in that conflict. And many of that goes unacknowledged. Many of those things go unacknowledged. But that is the result of building those alliances and working toward that prevention. Now, I spend a lot of my time now in mediation or facilitation or negotiation or whatever you want to call it. And I have learned a whole new world, and a world of techniques that are growing. How to build and improve capacities of the sides negotiating to move them up to an even plane. How to put in, as third parties, multiple layers, not only mediators, but those that can stand above the process and provide advice. How to bring in technicians that understand the art of negotiation, that can help one side or the other. When I was in Indonesia working with the Free Aceh movement and the government of Indonesia, imagine this: you have a government in Jakarta. The negotiations are being done by a professional diplomat and a team under the auspices of their leading minister, under the direction of the president. The Free Aceh movement in the jungles of Sumatra have a small exile government in Stockholm, Sweden. Many of them have day jobs. The foreign minister worked at the post office in Stockholm, had to get a day off when we had negotiations. Now bring them to the table. It's uneven. The work you need to do to improve one side, to build the capacity to negotiate and to understand how the agreements will be formed, implemented, monitored, carried out, how complaints and problems will be brought forth, how these things will be adjusted and handled in the end, how we take civil society and make sure they have a separate voice. It's too easy to say we have two sides that both claim to speak for the people. How do you create the people as a separate entity at that table? Many times I have found in these negotiations that people say a pox on both your houses. We are the ones that are suffering, and we want a direct voice in these negotiations. The art of bringing them to the table is critically important, and empowering them and giving them a voice. Elements of the population that don't normally have a voice, in many cases women, in many cases minorities, in many cases ethnic groups or religious groups that have been oppressed for years. How do you bring them in and legitimize them and move them to a position on the table where they have a say and can be confident in the outcome? This is the kind of work that is done by institutes like the Kroc Institute, by the Henri Dunant Center, by the U.S. Institute of Peace, and many other organizations around the world. The investment in these organizations will pay dearly in conflict prevention and in conflict mitigation. We learn lessons every day on this. We learned that agreements themselves can't stand. I was involved for a year in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Believe me, we could paper the walls of this room with all the agreements that have been signed and agreed to and not ever carried out and implemented on the ground for whatever reason. Every one of these problems is unique, but after we experience them, whether they work or don't work, we add to our toolbox. We add to our own lessons, to our own techniques, and we learn again. I would just close by saying, representing as a former military person, the United States military, we have to come to grips with the role of the military. That's probably the most important issue we have now. Are we going to legitimize the military's role in this end of the business? If so, in this process of transformation, it needs elements and capabilities within it, the doctrine, the training, the organization to handle these. If we're not going to legitimize it, then are we going to put it somewhere else in government? What we ought to learn by Iraq is when the State Department had to deploy to the field, they don't have a field force. They scraped the bottom of every embassy to get 144 people. They put people out there that don't know the region, the culture, the language, the issues, or are not qualified for their specific area that they're thrown into, to run an oil ministry, to help coordinate security or the development of the police. We can't have pickup teams in this business. It's too complex and too difficult. Either the military is going to do it and we're going to legitimize it, or we're going to have other agencies of government do it, and we're going to give them the resources and the capacity to develop the component parts they should provide, political, economic, social, in addition to the military's provision of security, and then train them together, develop a strategy, develop what we need to understand how we perform on this battlefield together. The third option is to keep doing it the way we are, and we will keep paying in blood and treasure if we do. Thank you. I'll be glad to take your questions.
Since our focus has been preventing deadly conflict, you mentioned that U.S. foreign aid has really not been dedicated to prevention. And I'm wondering, now that you're more on the political diplomatic side, if you have any recommendations for what we can do to try to get more resources dedicated to early warning and action prevention.
Well, obviously there's a lot of competition for budget money. The Congress does support, for example, the U.S. Institute of Peace. It was created by Congress and funded by Congress. I think what Congress needs to understand and be educated on is the value of investing in prevention. I think what we on the other end, those institutions that implement it, I include in that the military institutes like the Kroc Institute, the U.S. Institute of Peace, and others. We need to demonstrate what the investment could provide and how effective it could be. It is amazing how many times we have stopped conflict and we don't even realize it. During the 1998 buildup between the Pakistanis and the Indians, getting ready for the Third World War, believe me, they had scared themselves, and it was like World War I, where mobilization was on automatic, and they were about to go to war over the incursion into Kargil by the Pakistanis. President Clinton sent me out to talk to Prime Minister Sharif and to General Musharraf to see if we could convince them to withdraw from Kargil. It was a long shot. He sent me because the only connection we had with Pakistan, because of the sanctions we had on them, was the friendship, military to military, that I had maintained with President Musharraf and his predecessor, General Karamat. And when I got out there, Prime Minister Sharif would not see me. He didn't want to see a general. He said, if somebody's going to come see me, it should be the Secretary of State or somebody more senior. And I had to send a message that this is the best you're going to get. And General Musharraf saw me, and I told General Musharraf, the Prime Minister won't see me, but I need to convey a message from the President to him. And we've got to stop this before we end up in a bloody war that could be a disaster. He said, give me 10 minutes. 10 minutes, I was in to see Prime Minister Sharif. What Sharif needed to back down from this and to stop this potential for a catastrophic war was some face-saving measure. And what he needed was a meeting with the President of the United States. And by meeting with the President of the United States, showing that that relationship may be coming back, that he was listening to the pressures of the most powerful nation in the world, could help him with his own people, and could help the justification to mitigating this problem and withdrawing from the conflict. I was empowered to tell him the President would meet with him if he demonstrated movement out of Kargil. We monitored it across from of course, from our satellites. When his forces began to move, President Clinton immediately had Prime Minister Sharif to Blair House in Washington, met with him, and they both announced the agreement that they would withdraw and tensions were reduced and we prevented a war. Now I want to tell you, on the thin thread of a personal relationship, we were able to make that happen because we took a chance on a small effort. Now imagine formalizing that. Imagine providing an institute that not only understands the issue, understands the cultures, understands the methods, that can go into these situations and can help both sides come to agreement. It is a small investment to make that happen. And I think what we've got to do is show those that determine where our resources go how this can work and legitimize this process and internationalize it too. Because in many cases, it can't work alone. It needs an international complexion to it when you do this work. It shows the international legitimacy of your effort, and it shows the will of the international community to want it to have to happen. And sometimes that's enough face-saving for those that really don't want to go to war, to have some sort of foundation for telling their people that I've chosen another course.
Thank you. If you could, how would you advise President Bush on the Palestinian-Israeli conflict and what needs to be done first, second, etc.?
Well, I think what we have tried to do but has failed is we have tried to return the two sides to where they were in the late 90s during Camp David, Taba, when they were at a point where they were putting the final status issues on the table and they were working up possible solutions to it. Since then, obviously, we've gone through the second intifada and down into probably the worst set of conditions we've had in the Middle East. What we have tried to do is bring it back there by putting other sort of confidence-building arrangements in place first. There was a feeling as the intifada grew and the violence grew and the so-called cycle of violence continued that we needed to take some steps first before you got back to that table with those final status issues. So Senator Mitchell was sent out And he proposed this Mitchell Plan. The Mitchell Plan was designed to do some confidence building measures first before you step back into that final status negotiations. Both sides agreed to the Mitchell Plan, but it never got implemented. So we sent George Tenet out. George Tenet was going to work on security issues, put together a security plan. The security issues would be worked first, then we would go into the Mitchell Plan, then we would go into the final status issue. Both sides agreed to the Tenet Plan. Nothing happened. Then Zinni was sent out. And my mission was to get the Tenet Plan into play. I made the mistake of putting a Zinni Plan on the table, although I said I wouldn't do it. And pretty soon, come to the realization we're moving backwards, not forwards. I think it was well-intentioned, but this idea of sequentialism and this narrow path to peace or roadmap is the wrong way to go. The final status issues, everybody knows what they are. Everybody probably knows within a percentage or a mile or two how they're going to turn out. I think there are incentives that could be put on the table by the outside world to help this. But several things have to happen. One is we have to stop the business of special envoys, high-profile special envoys that do touch and goes out there. That as soon as there's a violent act or something doesn't go right, the envoy's pulled, another envoy comes in a year later. We need a large delegation on the ground. It needs to be international. It needs to work political, economic, social, monitoring issues all at the same time. And it needs to stay there and have an address there. And it needs to try to light 1,000 fires instead of one fuse that's very narrow like I described that can be easily upset. The second thing that has to happen is the President of the United States has to be directly involved. He can't subcontract it out to the Secretary of State or a special envoy or anybody else. Unfortunately, given everything else the President has on his agenda, this has to be his. It takes the clout and the power of the office of the President of the United States, I think, to make these two parties negotiate in good faith and come to the point where they have to make the kinds of compromises to live in peace in the long term. The third thing that I think has to happen is that the people have to become involved. I found myself walking the streets of Tel Aviv or Ramallah and having people come up to me in tears, begging me, families, not to abandon them, not to leave them, to find some way they can live in peace with the people on the other side, some kind of arrangement. And sometimes I think the politics by the parties involved miss the point and miss what the people want. This Geneva Accord that was put together that probably had a lot of flaws in it had an idea of surveying the people on both sides as to what they would accept. The leadership on both sides did not like the idea. I like the idea. I think we ought to poll the Israeli people and the Palestinian people to see what's acceptable in the long term. It's their peace. I would leave you with one piece of advice that I got from a very wise man, the wisest man I met in this whole process, Shimon Peres. And when I first arrived and met with him, he said, you will meet three kinds of people in this process, on both sides. You will meet the righteous. And he said, don't waste your time. And he said, you will meet the collectors of arguments. They want to win a debate on CNN. Don't waste your time. And he said, the vast majority of those poor people that are out on those streets of Tel Aviv and Ramallah, focus on them. And I think that's the third thing that has to happen in this process.
I'm going to start in with some of the questions on the current situation in Iraq. And one question has to do with this recent documentary, The Fog of War, where former Secretary Robert McNamara expressed shock and surprise many years afterwards that the Vietnamese saw the war as a revolution, not a fight against communism. How do you think the Iraqis see this war?
Well, first of all, going back to Vietnam, since I spoke Vietnamese and I wore the uniform of the Vietnamese Marines and I lived in their villages, it didn't shock me when I was a second lieutenant. I'm surprised it shocked the Secretary of Defense, but it doesn't surprise me. The Iraqi, you have to understand who the Iraqis are. They have never known democracy. They have never known a free market economy. They have never been able in their history to determine in their recent history to determine their own fate. They got, pooped out of the end of the Ottoman Empire. Along comes Winston Churchill and Lawrence of Arabia, and over dinner draws the boundaries. And they immediately take the Hashemite king from the Hajj, who's been ejected by King Abdulaziz, take him out of the Hijaz, down where Mecca and Medina are, and make him the king of Iraq. And it's been downhill since then. Now, all of a sudden, we come in and we say, we're going to solve your problems. And we hear, they hear, they're going to be a democracy. They're going to determine their own fate. There's going to be jobs, a new economy. Expectations went very high, very fast, as happens in these situations. Too high, too fast. And I think there was a strong underestimating of the problems in there and what reconstruction would take. I heard one of our senior leaders say that he was shocked at how these institutions just collapsed. Well, hello. Saddam Hussein controlled them all. You're going to walk in and rip him out, de-Ba'athify, get rid of all the Ba'athists and know how the trains run right down to the lowest level, disband the army, tell anybody who's in business, if he was a Ba'athist, which he had to be to do business before, he can't do business anymore. You're going to bring in the exiles who have no credibility inside Iraq and prop them up in the governing council, and then you wonder why the institutions came apart? You're going to go in there with insufficient troops to freeze the situation, allow the looting and the chaos. I'm amazed that we're surprised by kidnappings today. There were 400 kidnappings a day immediately when the mission accomplished major fighting stopped of Iraqis. They've just now switched the kidnapping over to others. This should not be a surprise. You know, but I think what I would say to anyone that's dealing with this now is we have two hopes left. One is named Ambassador Brahimi, and he's got to pull a rabbit out of the hat to save our bacon. The other is the one I put my faith in, the Iraqi people, that despite all this, they're going to come to the realization that we aren't providing any magic solution. They're going to have to do this themselves. That's our last hope, that they can pull this out. But we're going to be in there for a long while, and we've broken a lot of China in this part of the world, not to mention Europe and other places where we've had allies. And putting this back together gets more difficult every day. There is a rule in ditch digging. When you find yourself in a hole, stop digging. And the trouble is we keep making more mistakes. This 3,000-man embassy in Baghdad, you've got to be out of your mind. Why do we have a 3,000-man embassy in Baghdad? You know, we still look like the occupation forces. When we turn this over to June 30th, on whoever we turn it over to, we don't even know, what's their responsibility? Will the people of Iraq, the different groups, listen to them, abide by their rulings? What is the role then of our military? I have some simple questions like, who do all these contractors answer to then? If these 20,000 contractors running around with guns in this, that we subcontracted to do this business out there, if they shoot somebody, whose court do they answer to? Ours or theirs once it's passed? I mean, there's a lot of small issues like that that have to be dealt with. And I think we're going to run into, unfortunately, a long stretch here without much help from anybody else on the outside. Again, the two hopes are Brahimi and the Iraqi people. That's what it comes down to now.
Thank you. From a graduate student of history, we have, how can the U.S., as a perceived occupying force in Iraq, successfully transition into the role of peace facilitator in a legitimate constitutional development process?
By turning it over to the UN. And by figuring out what it would take. Because the UN, obviously, the UN being the other nations that make it up in the Security Council, will take it on only if they have a say in the political reconstruction and the economic reconstruction. And if they're going to take it off our hands, or they're going to oversee this and contribute and burden share, not only in troops, but in what it's going to take to reconstruct the country in resources, then they have a right to have a say. We should have let the UN process play out. The UN has always delivered the authority to use force in the past. The first President Bush spent a lot of time making sure he had that UN resolution and building a coalition before the first Gulf War. It took time. It took Secretary Baker. It took Secretary Cheney. It took Colin Powell running around the world constructing this thing and make sure we had it in place. We had a remarkable turnout for the first Gulf War. Secretary Powell, when he went to the UN, pulled a 15-0 vote for Resolution 1441 at the beginning of this. All we had to do is let those inspectors play out. Those inspectors, those UN inspectors, have always delivered in the past. In my time there, Ralph Achaeus and Richard Butler called it as they saw it, were honest in their reporting. And we got authorization from the UN to take military action and use force when those inspectors were faced with non-compliance and non-cooperation. All we had to do was wait for it. But what struck me is the State Department and our diplomacy was going on one channel, and our Department of Defense was going to war in March. This channel was going to take longer. This channel was going to war in March. And all of a sudden it was, well, we're there. It's summertime. We have to attack. The only troops that train in the summer in the Persian Gulf are Americans. You know, I got to tell you from experience. You know, so to me it was a bogus line.
And the final question, and this was difficult, but I think relates to the political process in relation to the military, which is how do you see the role of senior military leaders in the political process of making policy before military forces are sent into conflict?
Well, the military leaders have an obligation to the President of the United States and to the Congress, the senior military leaders, to give them their best advice and opinion on either the military mission or the application of the force. Remember before the war when General Shinseki testified before Congress and gave his honest opinion. When you get confirmed to be a chief of service or to be a combatant commander in unified command, you, before the Senate Armed Services Committee, answer the first question, will you appear before this committee and give us your honest opinion and view, even if it contradicts administration policy? Well, guess what? You want that 4th star, you better say yes. Then you better deliver when the time comes. It is difficult, but our senior military leaders must be confirmed by 100 senators, all 100. And if you want to be confirmed, you owe an obligation to them as the representative of the American people to give them your honest view, even if it contradicts administration policy. That's a dual obligation. It's tough because on one hand you answer to your boss, the Secretary of your service or the Secretary of Defense, depending on which position you hold, and then the President of the United States. So you have this dual loyalty and obligation. But your obligation is to speak the truth. If it means that the President of the United States and the Secretary of Defense no longer has faith in you, then so be it. You have to leave. Our military only has 2 choices. Either salute and follow the order, or put your stars on the table and walk away and speak the truth. Either way, you have to make the choice. I know which one I would choose. I would have been long gone in this administration, I can tell you that.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you.